Hey guys, I'm Sunny Galt with Parents on Demand. Thanks so much for being with us today. Parents on Demand is a podcast network specifically for parents and for caregivers, and that's all the content that we do that's part of the network. So if you're interested in that, check us out, parentsondemand.com. One of the things we love to do for our members is educate them. There's always new things happening in podcasting and stuff that maybe you haven't thought of before. So we're doing a series of more legal questions that people have, and today we're talking about release forms. And I have to admit that, I phrased this in the video as a question. Does your podcast need release forms? But honestly, I feel like we kind of know the answer to that question. Yes, we do. So let's figure out what we need to have as part of these release forms. Joining me now is Gordon Firemark. He is an entertainment, media, and business lawyer, and he has his own podcast as well. It's called the Entertainment Law Update. Gordon, welcome. Thanks for being with us today.
Hi, Sunny. I'm glad to be here.
All right. So Gordon, do podcasts need release forms?
I think the phrase should be, why do podcasts need release forms? But
I think so too.
It's surprisingly controversial in the space. If you go in the Facebook groups and with podcasters, you'll see a lot of people saying, no, I never use one. I wouldn't dream of asking my guests to do that. They don't do that in public, in broadcast radio. Why would I do that in a podcast? And the answer is, look, a podcast isn't broadcast radio. Broadcast radio happens and then it's done and it's gone and people forget about it. Yeah, there might be a recording somewhere, but people aren't downloading that much. When you're making something that has some permanence, it's an evergreen content kind of a thing, you want to make sure you protect yourself. So the release is a contract, an agreement between the guest and the producer or the host of the show that says, you have the right to record my performance on your show, and you have the right to use it in any way you want, or maybe sometimes it's limited ways, and you have the right to use it for a length of time, hopefully forever and ever and ever, everywhere in the world, in any and all media in the world. So there's sort of 5 layers to what the release needs to include. And of course, it needs to have some binding permanent effect. So that's what release form is all about, and that's what they're there to protect the podcaster for. Let's face it, you're making an investment of time and energy and resources in making this recording. You want to be sure you own it and have the right to use it.
So that seems easier to do if it's a one-on-one kind of thing, like if you can, just deal with one person. But what if, and I think this happens more with video, but it could happen in podcasting as well. What if you're recording in a space and you could pick up other things, other people, I've seen in video them put, general signs up to say, hey, we're recording, just so you know. Does that fly with podcasting as well?
It sure does. That signage kind of release is useful because, the point is you want to make sure that people understand, if I say something here in this space where there's a microphone nearby, you're going to keep it and use it and do what you want with it, and you're not going to pay me anything for it. Right. So I think that is a good way to do it. It's also wise to, as you start recording, make the announcement, say, hey, we're starting to record now. Anything that we hear from you is going to belong to us, and we're going to use it, that kind of thing.
Okay. And I think most of the time we're going to be doing these release forms with adults, but what about kids? If we're going to have kids on our show, do the same rules apply for kids?
It's really tricky working with kids. In some places, kids are sort of autonomous and they have they're not property of their parents. In other places, they are considered like property. If you're in one of those places where it's like property, then more power to you. You get the parents to sign the release on behalf of the kid, acknowledging that I'm the legal guardian or whatever, and you're good to go. But in some places, parents don't have the right to. In most places, parents don't really have the right to bind their children into contract. We call that slavery, and so we don't do that. Well, we do that with our children, don't we? But
it's debatable.
Clean up the dishwasher, empty the dishwasher, do the dishes, but. We aren't going to bind a kid to a contract signed by a parent. And in fact, kids can't make binding contracts themselves. So it's a little tricky. And if you're doing that here in California, especially, you probably want to talk to a lawyer who can help you, like me, who can help you with this specific situation.
Okay. And there are several different ways we can do these release forms. I really want to break them down because people have a lot of questions about this. So we could do this digitally. And I would even say there's a couple ways we could do this digitally. We can do this the old-fashioned way with pen and paper, and we can do this verbally, because a lot of times as podcasters, we're not in the same room with whoever, you know, we need to get the release form from. So let's talk about digital first. And I said there's a couple different ways to do this. I've seen more the Google form way of doing this, where they just type their name, which to me personally, I'm not a lawyer, but seems like anybody could do that. And is that really binding? Or you have more of the companies where you can actually send a contract and they can do their signature. And to me, that seems a little bit more legit. But again, I'm not an expert. So what's your take on this?
Well, let me start. Well, let's dispose of the blue ink on a piece of hard copy paper real quickly. I'm a fan of that. I really like the idea of the formality of it, because people tend to remember doing that. Oh yeah, I did sign a contract. And so that's useful. Just if they ever do come calling and complaining, you say, well, wait a minute, remember that release you signed? Oh yeah, I do. You know, so that's good. But it's impractical in a lot of situations, and I understand that. So the digital approach is, all of them are better than not having a release. Okay. The Google Form style that you talked about, where they're just typing in their name and saying, yes, I agree. You're right. Anybody could do that. But realistically, are you going around trolling people by signing releases for them? You know, it doesn't really happen. And usually those forms can be set up to track the IP address where somebody came from. So if there ever was a dispute about whether or not they really did it, you can have some evidence. You know, if you're getting into litigation, you have evidence about that kind of thing you can use. The DigiSigner, the electronic signature services where they sort of maintain an escrow and track things, that's fabulous. And I love that approach, but there's an expense associated with it. So my feeling is, even if it's just when you register, sign up and select a time for your interview, if they have to sort of tick a box and say, yes, I agree, that is good enough for 99.9% of the such scenarios. And the important thing is that there's a document there that lays out all of those 5 or 6 things I said to you, so that the parties, are both agreeing to the same thing.
Okay. So that's helpful. So even if they're checking a box, I like the idea that you said that if needed to, if this went to court or something, they could track it back to a computer. So I'm like, okay, that's more of like a digital fingerprint. I get that. I did have a follow-up question, because you mentioned the paper stuff. So if we are not in the same room, and I've done it both ways, which is really nice. When you're in the same room, you can be like, boom, done. In fact, I have a whole folder just full of that stuff. But if you're not, and you do more of let me send you this file electronically, you sign it, send it back to me. Usually that's a copy. Is that an issue as opposed to getting the original?
Contract law is all about the parties manifesting their assent or their agreement to the terms of the document. So I think that, again, if I get an email from you that says, here's that document, I already signed it, that's good enough for me. I feel like we've made a contract.
Yeah.
And yes, I'm getting a copy and all that, but I think that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to make sure in the court system that they're okay with that too. And we didn't just waste our time.
Yeah, I mean, there's something called the best evidence rule where you have to bring in the best copy available.
Okay.
But by the time you get there, you're going to subpoena the document from the other side or whatever, if they still have it. And if not, then what you've got is the best evidence.
All right, so let's talk about the verbal release, if you will. I did this a lot in recording my shows. In fact, and this was really before Google Forms was even an option, okay? So I've been podcasting a long time. Yeah. And that was just the easiest way to do it. You're already recording, you have to make sure you record it. If we haven't said that already, make sure you're recording. And I would ask a few questions, which I know I didn't get it all, but I said, what's your name? What's today's date? Indicate that you're being recorded, and that you give name of the podcast, permission to use this in our episodes. And it was that simple. And that's what I would do. And now here's the part where you tell me I missed a bunch of stuff.
Well, you and I both know that because you actually had an issue come up with a former guest. But let me cover the question first. So that's fine. Look, it's better than not having any kind of a release at all. The important thing is that you make sure that if you're going to do that you cover all those bases, and you make sure you use the right words every single time. And that's what's challenging, is unless you've got a very clear, probably a lawyer written script for that oral release, you may miss something, like leaving out the word irrevocable consent, or you have the right to use this forever and ever and ever. In perpetuity is the legal term we use. Or naming the media and articulating that they're not going to get paid for it, even if you then later put it into some kind of a commercial product. And so what often happens is, yeah, I'm going on a podcast. Sure, I'm happy to be on your podcast. And then your podcast turns into part of a commercial product, or you bundle it up and sell it to your listeners or something like that. Well, where's my piece of the money?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you didn't say that. And when you asked me for that release, when you asked me if it's okay to record, I said, sure, for a podcast. So these are the kinds of things that come up. And in the situation you encountered, I think some of the issues were the in perpetuity language and the any and all media. And there were some sort of implicit agreements about the nature of the content itself and what happened. Well, you can tell what happened with your show.
Yeah. So in my situation, this was a guest who was on our podcast. She did a series. So she did like 4 or 5 episodes. We released the episodes. This was at least 2 years later. We started working with an advertiser she didn't approve of. Now, this was not a quote unquote bad advertiser. It fit, our demographic. She just didn't like the fact that this advertiser sold baby bottles. So she did not want her content. She wanted me to take down her episodes.
Yeah.
And when I said, I can't do that, I had the recorded verbal release from her because she wasn't in the studio. But I did that for every episode. I went back and I checked. I had the original files. Did I get this? Yes, I got this. She gave me the release. Her stuff had been on our website for 2 years. Her likeness. So because we put up the image of the expert and their bio, to give our audience an idea of who the guest was. And so the episodes have been out there for a long time. And she asked me to take it down. And I said, I can't do that. And it led to her sending me papers that she was essentially going to sue me, that she was in the process of suing me. And that's actually how I got to know you, Gordon. Yeah. Like, Gordon, what do I do with this?
The most unfortunate circumstances in which most people meet a lawyer is just what you just described. And, you and I had conversations about your journalistic integrity and not taking stuff down just because somebody made a threat. But it's a lot easier to have that integrity when you've got a solid piece of paper or something to show to the judge and say, look, Your Honor, this is BS.
Yes.
I have the right to do this, and she knew I had the right to do it, and so on. In that situation, there was another component actually in the situation with you had, and that was that she had provided you a picture and her bio and stuff like that. And guess what? As we talk about in copyright law, she had created those, or photographer had created the photo, and she had created her bio. So she owned those copyrights and hadn't transferred ownership or a license to you. Again, something that a well-worded podcast release will include. Any materials I'm submitting to you as part of this, you have the right to use them in perpetuity as well. So she had some leverage on us because of that. And ultimately meant hiring lawyers and either duking it out or settling out and whatever, and spending a lot of money and some sleepless nights, I'm sure.
And that's just it. You could end up spending a ton of money to fight something, even if you're in the right, and I think as podcasters, we have to weigh how important is this? Now, in my specific situation, she was pretty influential in her field, which was what my podcast was all about. Mm-hmm. So she could influence other experts to take down their episodes. And I could see this domino effect where once I had 170 episodes, I suddenly had 15, and so I think we have to take this on a case-by-case basis, like what impact is this going to have overall, and how important is this to you? But just to know, even if you're in the right, this could still cost money. This could still impact your family in a lot of different ways. Now, we ended up taking down those episodes and the whole case went away. So I think I was lucky. Other people may not be so lucky in that, but again, always important to.
You were lucky, but there was a sacrifice made, and had you had the right releases, you might still have made the decision to take the episodes down, but you would have known you were in the completely in the clear, and it would have been a different conversation we were having with her lawyers.
Yeah, and now it's a learning experience, so I can share it with everybody else and be like, you need to have your release forms. Would you recommend, though, if people were to do a verbal release, not to beat a dead horse, but if they were to do that, and they had someone like you prepare a statement, basically, could a host read the statement and record it, obviously, and then just have the expert or the guest say, yes, I agree to everything you just said? Like, could that fit the mold?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the free podcast release form, here's a plug, the free podcast release form that I have created and made available for everybody includes a script for that kind of oral release as well as a written one that you can use. So you can get that at podcastrelease.com.
So it's probably in the release form, but real quickly, can we go through some of the important things that you need to make sure that are in any kind of release?
Yes. It's sort of the who, what, where, when, how, and why. You know, who are the parties, of course. You have to identify what are we doing here? We're making a recording. You have the right to use the recording. And then you get into the question of what media, in any media at all ever now known or hereafter created, and for how long? What's the time frame? So hopefully it's in perpetuity or forever and ever. And also maybe what territory. If someone wants to limit it for some reason, I guess you could do that. I always say the universe, just to be on the safe side.
So if you go outside the Milky Way, you might be in trouble then.
I even once said, and all planes of existence now known or
just to be safe.
Excuse me. And then you want to make sure you cover the copyright materials that are submitted or provided as part of this process. Also, with a sentence that says, "And any materials I've provided, I own, and I'm giving them to you for free to use." And maybe even a statement that says, "And you're not going to be compensated for this." Yeah. So you definitely want to include all those elements.
Do you recommend giving that to guests in advance? Because a lot of times what was happening when I was in more of a recording studio environment, guests would come in, I'd give them this piece of paper and they'd be like, "Whoa, where's my attorney?" You know, that could be pretty intimidating for people.
Yeah, I think it's wise to send it before, really at the time you're booking the interview, send that over and say, "I'm going to need this back before we record. If you have any questions, reach out to me," whatever. And it's probably a good idea to even if you decide to use the oral release, send that information anyway, saying, "Here's what I expect of the guests when I come on. I'll ask you about it on the recording." Like I said, I'd rather they send it back to you in writing, but if for some reason somebody doesn't, then you do that oral release, get it recorded. You still got the information, and they can't say, "Oh, I didn't know you wanted to use it that way."
Yeah. And then make sure you save those files, put them in a very safe spot, whether it's written or whatever.
Develop a good system for that. Absolutely.
All that good stuff. All right, great. Gordon, how can people find you online and learn more about you and your services?
Well, that podcast release is at podcastrelease.com. And the rest of my stuff you'll find at a clearinghouse website at gordonfiremark.com.
Perfect. Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you.